In these following videos, starting with this one, I am going to show you techniques used for retouching images. Now, Photoshop is mainly famous for its retouching capabilities, or we can say sometimes even infamous for its features, because there are examples where retouching went wrong, and we could also argue whether it's actually ethically a good thing that most of the images are being retouched in publications, magazines, and online. So thanks to Photoshop, it's almost impossible to tell whether you are looking at a genuine image or something that's already been manipulated or modified. And even some big camera makers got into trouble sometimes that they awarded images that later on been found out as being manipulated. But let's start with something definitely harmless, removing a couple of things from this image. Hopefully these goats won't get upset, but we just want to remove the wire on the top and maybe the branches here on the left side, and also we can play around with a couple of other details as well. First, before you do any retouching, try to always do it non-destructively, and the way you can do that is by creating a separate layer. So by clicking on the new layer icon, then you can call it retouch. But we will do all our retouching on this layer. So that means it won't affect the original image, the background layer. The retouching tools are all here, or almost all of them can be found in the same place. We will start with the first one called Spot Healing Brush Tool. The shortcut is J if you want to quickly get to this. And this tool is a brush, which means we can change the size with the square brackets. You don't need it to be too big. Try to keep it close to the size that will cover the details that you need to remove. Now, one important thing to do is to make sure you select the Sample All Layers option. This is necessary if you want to do your retouching on that separate empty layer. And if you are using a pen tablet, you can also turn on the pen pressure option, just like for the brush tool, and that way whenever you paint and you press harder, you can change the brush size, and when you press less hard on the tablet, you can reduce the brush size. But you see, once I let go, it automatically replaces the content. And the way this tool works is that it samples from the image, mainly in the surrounding areas, looking for similar details that can be used for the replacement. So you don't have to do anything special, just simply paint over details. And sometimes you might want to paint over a few details a couple of times. Plus, another useful thing to do is to reduce the hardness of your brush, because using it on 100% might not give you as good results as with a softer edge brush. So I'm just going to continue painting over these details here and then carry on painting over these parts. And it's all about just going over these details until you completely remove the unwanted cable in this case. So I'm just going to the left side. And by the way, if you use a mouse, you can also just click on one side and then shift click on the other side if it's a straight line. That way you can very quickly remove the details. That doesn't really work well with the pen tablets. So with pen tablets, it's more likely that you have to paint over details to remove them. But if you want to remove bigger details like these branches here, I recommend to make a bigger selection. So don't make too small details, because that might not delete it properly. Sometimes it just duplicates details that you are actually planning to remove. So best is to cover a bigger area first. Then Photoshop knows exactly that you want to remove all those details, so it won't keep duplicating the unwanted parts. And then of course you can paint over some details a couple of times until it's completely removed. So this is how it looks before, by turning off the retouch layer, and after. But just to see this used on bigger details, I'm going to zoom closer to the front of the image and making my brush size bigger. Let's see what happens if I maybe just increase the hardness also slightly and paint over these details here in the front. So removing these 3 rocks, let's see what happens. It did quite a good job, but replicated a detail that again just looks weird. So I'm just going to paint over that, and then also paint over this detail here. And you can see with a couple of brush strokes, we managed to replace a very big detail again in the image. So now if I zoom out, that's the final result. That's all I wanted to retouch in this image. And most of the time, if you want to retouch and also improve the image, tonal values, colors, or contrast, it's always good to do the retouching first and then apply filters or adjustment layers. That way your adjustments will apply to both the retouch layer and the original image. So in this case, for example, if I want to use the camera raw filter, I can select both of my layers first, go to filter, convert for smart filters, which will wrap the two layers into one smart object. And then I can choose again, filter, camera raw filter, play around with these values like increase the shadows, reduce the highlights, maybe increase the overall exposure, add a bit of vibrance, add a bit of clarity, and then we get a very nice result. Maybe we can also use another effect I use sometimes. Under the FX panel, you can drag post-crop vignetting to the left side to add a bit of darker corner around the image. Or brighter as well if you drag it to the right. I prefer to use it for adding a bit of darker details in the corners. Now I'm going to click OK. And of course our camera raw filter will be added as a smart filter, so we can always turn it off and turn it back on whenever we want to see the results. In case you forgot to retouch a detail, you can of course always go back later by double-clicking on the layer's thumbnail, which will take you to the source of the smart object, where you will still find your retouch layer. So let's say I found a little detail here which I want to remove. I just switch back to the spot healing brush and then I can paint over this detail. Once I'm ready with that, don't forget you have to go to File, Save to update these changes. Once that's saved, I can close this document, and then when we go back, we can see the version with the camera raw filter, but with the amend we just did on the retouch layer. So that was before and after. Now just to stay with farm animals, let's have a look at another example of sheep. So what I want to do here first is to remove the fence in the background. Once again, I'm going to create a new layer first. I will call it retouch. And then when I zoom closer, I can start using the spot healing brush tool. So I will start painting over these details, and you will see that after a while we will be able to get rid of it, just like before the wire or that cable from the other image. So as you can see, once I paint over this part here, it's pretty good. There's one problem though. Transition between the background and the foreground, it's not consistent or it's not perfect. Even after a couple of brush strokes, it's still creating strange color details here. That is again because of this tool is automatically sampling from the image. And the fact that there is so much green space here, Photoshop is not sure whether to sample from the foreground or the background. That's why you get unexpected results. But in these cases, it's best to swap tools and switch to the healing brush tool, which I would call a more advanced version of the spot healing brush. With this, you have to sample from the image, and then you will know exactly what you are going to use for replacing details. Make sure you set this to all layers, just like using it with the spot healing brush tool. We have to set that in case we want to use it on a separate layer. And then all you need to do is to alt click on a detail which you want to use for replacement. Let's say I'm going to use this detail here. So holding down Alt or Option, click, and then hover over the part you want to paint over. And then when you start painting, you will see two cursors moving at the same time. The one at the bottom shows where I'm copying from. The one on the top shows where I'm copying to. The difference if you have older versions than CC is that you won't see the replacement while you are drawing. You will only see it once you let the brush go. That's again another advantage of using Creative Cloud. This feature works faster, so it gives you a live feedback. But even in previous versions, the tool itself works exactly the same. It just won't give you a live feedback. So let me select another sample point here, again with alt clicking, and then I can start paint over, and you can see that when I just go over small details, it might just start smudging it around. You can see the smudge around there as well. But once I paint over it properly, it starts to disappear. If I leave that detail like that, it looks a bit smudged. But once I paint over it, it will remove these details perfectly. Now, I'm removing some of the sheep as well because they were too close to the fence. Just going to paint over these. And then any fence detail I can still see, I can go over. Once again, there's a sheep. We have to sacrifice. It was just too close. So I remove that. When I zoom back, you can see that it looks pretty good. That was before. This is after. So we managed to get rid of the fence apart from this part here in the middle. Now I intentionally left this for last because here again, when I get close to the tree, if I want to keep the tree, it might create smudge details. As you can see there, already it starts to smudge details around, and the same thing would happen here. When I go over, it even starts to blend very weird results together. To keep the tree there, we will have to use a different tool, which won't automatically try blending details when I get close to an edge. So what happens if you want to remove some of the details that you don't like? So something you retouch, but you want to remove it. Once again, instead of using the history panel or undo, because we've done everything on a separate layer, we can just use the eraser tool and paint over the parts we don't like. That way we can very quickly remove them, thanks to the fact that they are on a separate layer. And before I move on to our next video, there's just one last thing I want to make sure you know about, and that's both of the healing brushes, both the spot healing and the normal healing brush, works the same way, that they not only copy and paste details, but they also blend the details into the new environment they have to appear on. So just to prove that to you, I am going to sample this little sheep here. So I alt click on it, and then instead of copying it over here where it would make sense, I'm going to go up and place it up somewhere here. And when I start drawing, you can see it tries really hard to blend this into the new environment. And when you look at the original and compare it to the new detail, you can see that the colors are slightly different. While at the bottom it's more greenish yellowish, here on the top it's more blue. The same thing would happen if I tried to paint this over these darker details here. You see here it got even more blue to be able to blend into that darker shady detail. These are extreme examples, and if you use the healing brush on a detail where it would make more sense, like here, there it will work really nicely. So it blends into this environment much better than the background. And that's all I wanted to show you about healing brushes. Now we are going to move on to one of the most important retouching tools, the clone stamp tool, which will be very similar to the healing brush, but with the main difference that it doesn't blend the sample details into the retouched areas. It just simply copy and pastes.